In this lecture, we're going to go over the first three traditionally accounted Chinese dynasties. I say traditionally accounted because the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, hasn't been verified by archaeological evidence, and many people think that it's mythological. In antiquity, and certainly up into the 20th century, Chinese traditional scholars treated it as historic fact. However, even if we don't have verified historical remains or contemporary written records from this dynasty, the information involved is very, very important in understanding future dynasties because it gives us a window into how Chinese historians thought, particularly in antiquity. So the first traditionally attested Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty, was founded by Yu the Great. And Yu is one of the few Chinese rulers to have that title, the Great, because he is what the ideal ruler should aspire to. Now, some have argued, particularly from the 20th century on, that Yu was a mythological figure, that he was a god transformed into an emperor by historians in the Han Dynasty about 2,000 years ago. Whether or not that's true is irrelevant for our purposes because Yu's story really does exemplify what a Chinese ruler is supposed to be. Yu is credited with being the first Chinese ruler to truly understand flood control, which, as we recall, is a vital process in the entire region of monsoon Asia. With the heavy rains, with the reliance on the super fertile river alluvial floodplain, this is a vital task for the maintenance of thousands and thousands of lives. This could affect yields dramatically, not to mention the disaster caused by flooding, which could be severe, particularly in antiquity. So what Yu did in the traditional account, unlike his father, Gun, who attempted to dam the river and control the water within the river, what Yu did is he created a system of irrigation canals and began dredging the silt in the river, basically digging up soil underneath the river and moving it so that he could keep the river down, keep the waters down, and also move those waters around to further expand the amount of good soil. Yu did create dams at particular locations, but he did not heavily dam the river to the extent that his father had attempted to, relying on these irrigation channels to move out excess water. Keep in mind that this is a culture in which family comes first, in which family identity is extremely strong. One thing that Yu is praised for, though, is that he put service to the state above the needs of his family. And this is something that has traditionally been considered very difficult for Chinese people to do, to put their own, the duty to the greater nation above that of their own clan. In the traditional account, Yu was chosen by King Shang to develop the solution to the river flooding problem only 4 days after Yu was married. So Yu dutifully left his wife and went about solving the problem. According to tradition, he stopped by his house multiple times, or walked by his house multiple times without stopping. The first time his wife was delivering her baby. The second time his son was several years old and was calling out to him. And by the end of his journey, his son was grown. But he still continued with his task without attending to his family duties. So committed was he to his cause of stopping the floods. And he was also credited with living among the workers, personally with a shovel, dredging out the river, doing all of the manual labor, eating the same food as the basic laborers. And this is something that, this example has endeared him to generations of Chinese scholars. In fact, one of the reasons that Yu is considered the ideal ruler is that he led by example. And this is a very important principle. Within the traditional Confucian system in ancient China, traditional China, and even in China still today, ruled by law, or what we might in the West call the rule of law, wasn't conceived of the same way as it is in the United States, for example. In the United States, in European countries, you have laws. Those laws are passed, everybody follows those laws, or doesn't and gets in trouble. In the traditional Chinese system, rulers didn't get compliance via law so much as via their example. So Confucius believed, and his subsequent disciples throughout the centuries believed, that you, by getting down in there with the workers, working hard, exerting himself to the fullest, that was the proper model for leadership. That if you're going to be a ruler, you're going to live virtuously, to work hard, to be what people need to see. That it doesn't matter how many laws you pass, that if the rulers are evil, if they do great evil acts, then the people will be evil. The people will be dissolute. But if the ruler is righteous, if he lives his life righteously, conducts himself morally, then the people will respond and imitate him. Because in the Confucian perspective, just like parents imitate a child, or just like children imitate their parents, subjects imitate their rulers, right? The family is a microcosm of the greater society. And ultimately, it was because of his great virtue that the king, Shang, chose Yu to succeed him over his own son, due to the fact that Yu had exhibited such noble virtue. Now let's talk about the last of the Xia dynasty rulers, a descendant of Yu, the final descendant of Yu to wield power, but nothing like Yu, King Jie. King Jie was given a very different title from that of the great, and that is the oppressor. And you can see here he is wielding a ji, which is a type of dagger axe, a big pole arm, a spear with a hilt, a half hilt that is designed to trap the enemy spears. And that's a symbol of him as a tyrant. And you can see he's sitting on two court ladies there. Again, a symbol of his tyrannical rule. He was extremely cruel. If servants didn't prepare his food exactly the way he wanted, if something was overcooked or undercooked or even just too spicy, he would have his entire kitchen staff beheaded and replaced. If someone broke a pot or a cup or displeased him in any tiny way, he would have them beheaded. And one of the reasons that he was so cruel, according to traditional historians prior to the 20th century, was that his consort, his wife, Mo Shi, considered to be an extraordinary beauty, had a very, very wicked heart. She not only demanded a life of luxury, of extreme luxury, she also had King Jie create a lake of wine. And the way that this worked, the lake was filled with wine, and she would have different palace girls kind of bathing naked in the wine. And according to tradition, 3,000 soldiers over the course of time ended up actually drowning in this lake of wine. And of course, in the tales, Moshi laughed as these soldiers, struggled to survive, and her husband also laughed as they were going into their death throes. And of course, these were his men, so it was seen as an act of betrayal on his part. How much of this is true and how much of it is baseless legend, we can't determine. But we can see kind of the mindset about what brings about the fall of a dynasty in the traditional Chinese conception. King Jie ended up having so many of his ministers executed for displeasing him for trivial offenses that the government stopped functioning. And as the government became more and more dysfunctional, he began to retreat more and more into a life of luxury with his queen. Eventually, one of his vassals, the future king of Shang, ended up convincing enough ministers to revolt with him, and he actually defeated King Jie at the Battle of Mingdao and ended the Xia dynasty, establishing the Shang dynasty. After the wicked reign of King Jie and the end of the Xia dynasty, we have the reign of King Dong of Shang, who overthrew his former king and established a new dynasty that he claimed would bring forth a period of moral rejuvenation, peace, and prosperity. And King Dong did enact some policies that we know of that contributed to this concept, particularly all of the farmers who had to sell their children into slavery during the later years of King Jie. King Dong of Shang actually minted the first gold coins, the first coins of solid gold, to give to these farmers so that they could buy back their children. And so we have the beginning of gold currency. He also, in the same vein as many of the rulers of the prosperous phases, early phases of Chinese dynasties, he radically cut taxes. The understanding at the time was that since the nobility were largely exempt from taxes, if the ordinary people paid their taxes in rice, in meat, etc., that by having more and that they would have more to build with. And not only that, by enjoying a larger share of their own, the fruits of their own labor, they would be incentivized to work harder and to produce more. And that this would in turn, ironically, raise government revenue, even though the tax rate was vastly reduced. And of course, this happened. And this is something that happened again and again throughout periods of renewal in Chinese history. So productivity increased rapidly in the early period of Shang rule. And we know this because we see that the sheer number of remains of farm animals increased rapidly. The amounts of grain left in offerings and in graves increased rapidly. And we know the population increased rapidly as well. King Dong also reduced the percentage of the year that males had to spend as conscripted soldiers. And ironically, this actually made the military stronger because over time it incentivized population growth. If you have more time to work on your farms, to grow your crops, the birth rate actually increases. On top of this benefit, King Dong was able to more effectively use the military, particularly by focusing on the use of chariots, which was, as we saw with India and the Aryan invasion, the chariot was the premier weapon of war during this period of time, during the early Bronze Age. We cannot mention the Shang without mentioning oracle bones. Oracle bones played a major role in the decision-making of Shang kings and nobility. And the way that this worked was you would have turtle shells and sometimes the shoulder blade of oxen or cattle. And these would have an inscription written on them, and then they would be cracked over a flame, and the cracks would be interpreted by a priest. So these were royal documents and are the primary historical sources we have for the events of the Shang dynasty. It gives us a great insight into Shang culture, how the Shang kings kept order with their nobility through organizing great hunts, how the Shang kings waged war, and how they managed their states. The Shang possessed advanced weaponry for the Bronze Age. The predominant weapon at the time was the dagger axe, or ji. The dagger axe was a very long spear with a bronze spear tip that was also fused with an axe head, usually a very narrow, thin axe blade. So this weapon could stab and hack from a distance. And when used in formation, this weapon enabled Shang infantry to sweep the field with devastating effect, especially over more undisciplined tribesmen, like the Yi tribesmen you see here, having been taken captive and sold into slavery. The Shang had mastered the use of pole arms, but their most dominant weapon was their great arm of war chariots. And these chariots were absolutely devastating. They could move to the flanks, attack the flanks of formations of infantry. They could pepper enemies with arrows from afar. And usually you had a driver, an archer, and a wielder of a pole arm, usually a ji. Sometimes you even had a dedicated soldier who threw javelins in the back of the chariot. So these were the ultimate in high-tech weaponry at the time. On the right, you see some ceremonial jade weapons. These were extraordinarily expensive and reserved for the nobility, and they were signs of high status when they were used as grave goods. The Shang dynasty graves, particularly of the elites, were very, 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 very elaborate, on par with those of Egypt. You not only had jade weapons and other luxury items, including more functional weaponry and suits of armor, but you would often have dozens of slaves sacrificed, particularly when we're talking about the burial of the upper nobility or royalty. Usually young girls who were part of the household staff would be killed and interred with their dead monarch. The collapse of the Shang mirrors that of the collapse of the Xia before them. In fact, the pattern is pretty much the same, at least to the ancient historians. The last king of the Shang was just like King Jia in that he was extraordinarily cruel. Just as King Jia married Moshi, King Dixin, the last king of the Shang, married Daji. Daji was extraordinarily cruel, and her favorite punishment to mete out to those whom displeased her was to force them to hug a searing hot bronze cauldron, which of course would kill them. But it was a very, very painful death. Like King Jia before him, Jixin also constructed a lake of wine. Only this time, he had an island placed in the middle that had trees consisting of meat on skewers. And just as the first king of Shang overthrew King Jia and ended the Xia dynasty, the first king of Zhou overthrew King Dixin and ended the Shang dynasty in a similar manner. The specifics aren't as important for our sakes as the understanding the general pattern, because this process of a moral ruler establishing a dynasty, prosperity coming, that dynasty becoming corrupted over time, eventually an evil ruler coming to power and the dynasty collapsing. This is central to what's called the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is the central ideology of dynastic change. You can see here the different characters for Tian, or heaven. You can see that in the beginning, it is essentially a god, a deity, that over time develops into a more abstract symbol. And just as the actual character changed, so did the concept of heaven, changing from a god to kind of an inanimate force, heaven being kind of the force of nature rather than an actual intelligent being. And it is Tian, or heaven, that ultimately legitimizes and leads to the prosperity and ultimately even the collapse of a dynasty. And the king of Zhou, who overthrew the Shang and established the Zhou dynasty, elaborated on the mandate of heaven and was the first to put it down in kind of its essential form. So the idea is that just as Yu the Great had built up the Xia dynasty, made it strong, made the land prosperous, obeyed morality, obeyed the moral law, strengthened the people, the dynasty prospered, and Yu's descendants prospered. As they turned towards evil, particularly during the reign of King Jia, at the end, his listening to his consort, despite the fact that she was morally compromised, his refusal to work hard to govern the land, and his own lack of virtue, that meant that the mandate of heaven was taken from him, and it was instead passed to the king of Shang, who overthrew King Jia and established the Shang dynasty. Well, when the king of Shang, when his descendant, Di Xin, turned to a similar evil path to that of King Jia, the mandate of heaven passed from the Shang to the Zhou. And there were many signs that a ruler was about to lose the mandate of heaven. Natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, peasant revolts, invasions by foreign tribes. These were all signs that the ruler was not doing what he was supposed to do. He was not living virtuously according to the mandate of heaven, and would, in fact, lose the mandate if he persisted. And, of course, one sign of an evil ruler in traditional Chinese historiography was that he listened to eunuchs, who were castrated servants, whom we'll talk about more at a later lecture, and to his consorts or concubines, to the women in his life, both of whom were seen as a corrupting force. Before this lecture ends, I want to turn your attention briefly to the exquisite bronzes that were produced during the Shang and Zhou era. Now, these are wondrous artifacts. Many of them were used as part of religious rituals. Many of them were grave goods. And these were technologically marvelous. We see them now, and they're green due to the aging process. At the time, they would have been a beautiful bronze. But these objects were not just religious objects, they're also symbols of power. There were the famous 9 bronzes that were supposedly handed down from the Xia dynasty through the Shang and into the Zhou. And these bronzes, these 9 bronze objects, were symbols of the state, symbols of the mandate of heaven. Due to the possession of these bronzes, the legitimacy of the ruler was shored up effectively. In fact, later on during the Han Dynasty, we'll see the development of what's called the imperial seal, which is a seal, bronze object that could be used as a stamp that was a sign that the ruler possessed the mandate of heaven.